Often, if they're low income, if they're poor, then they can't move. You know, they get off the boat and that's where they stay. So you think the Irish in Boston or New York, Philadelphia to this lesser degree. But then, you know, the Germans, as they came over, they're going to migrate in large numbers. And so all of these sort of shuns, as they're called here, are key themes that you definitely want to be familiar with. If there's an FRQ or a DBQ, these would be the kind of interconnected aspects of human behavior, not just political. And I think one of the things that's the problem of American history is it's often taught as it's either political or maybe, you know, the focus is on a handful of leaders and things like this. Well, this is more the knowledge of the overall nation, particularly the economic history. So economic history is important, obviously. So, you know, if you're writing down here, the thing about the 1850 census shows us that half of the American population is under the age of 30. You mind the census is done every 10 years. That's how we know so much about stuff, as long as it's done properly. And that means we're a very youthful country. Make sure you understand what the word demographics means, the study of groups, you know, particularly populations. And then I ask you on your study guide what it means to say that the demographic center. So I think I have a map in here. Yeah. So what the demographic center means is if you consider what these dots are on this sheet, these dots represent the number of Americans north and south are equal. So in other words, when we talk about like demographic center, at the start of our nation in 1790, half of all Americans lived east of this spot. You know, so from Philadelphia eastward, and the other half lived like all the rest, right? So as the decades proceed, you can see the north-south fairly consistent. Yeah, it fluctuates a little bit, but it's consistently shifting west. So if today we had to put like the center of America, the demographic population center of America, where might it be? Where do you think is out here? There has even been a discussion about moving the national capital to this location. It's in like the center of the country, both literally and demographic. Close, St. Louis. St. Louis. So, you know, St. Louis is kind of like the middle of America in terms of population. Not too far away from like Kansas, obviously, or Nebraska, but yeah, right around here, St. Louis. So that's what it means by demographic center. It means by this period, here's 1840, half the nation's population moved to the east of this, and half moved to the west. So that's a lot further, you know, westward is the best way to describe that. So definitely a westward moving country. Now, what was life like on the frontier? I like this sentence. It says, poorly fed, ill-clad, housed in hastily erected shanties. They were perpetual victims of disease, depression, and premature death. Well, gee, that sounds awesome, doesn't it? So life on the frontier was downright awful, okay? So, you know, it just tells you how important it was to individuals that they could have a place of their own, that they would risk all of that to live in one of these frontier settlements, if you want to call it that, or even singularly frontier. So what you see here is a fiercely individualistic society. Frequently, marooned, the book says, and ill-informed and superstitious. So in many ways, like many very, very rural communities that don't have much connection to anywhere else, tend to be the word is parochial, P-A-R-O-C-H, you know, parochial. But at the same time, very fiercely self-reliant, very fiercely self-sufficient. You know, I'm frequently reminded of there's a country music song by Hank Williams Jr. Talks about a country boy can survive. You know, like the idea is that if thrown into the wilderness, sort of a survivor show, much more likely to survive. And that's the kind of attitude of these people. These people would be folks like, not necessarily the many folks around here today. A lot of the folks around here are more recreational. It's not survival, it's recreational. But the skill set that is involved in that might be reflective of this. So I do want you to take away the Emerson essay first and foremost. Now, Emerson himself was an intellectual, so he was not a self-reliant frontiersman. I think this is one of the ironies of Ralph Waldo Emerson. But he very well captured the spirit and attitude of what was a lot of Americans at that time, which was that frontier existence, not depending on anybody else, and that's their definition of freedom. Being independent, literally. Other literature that's going to emerge during this period, literature of what's called the leather stocking tales, part of what's called Knickerbocker group. A group of Western New Yorkers are going to write. And so you should know Cooper and his character. Natty Bumppo is the main character of The Last of the Mohicans. He is an English frontiersman who lives with the Native Americans in Western New York. In other words, he lives as a Native American would live. He's gone native, we might say, and the French fear him. The Brits fear him. He's almost like a leather or a deerskin wearing Superman. His enemies called him La Longue Carbine, the long rifle. And in the book, in this book, and last week it's called Hawkeye. Is a good name, I think. Natty Bumppo doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well as Hawkeye. But again, fiercely reliant. And of course, you have Captain Ahab and his relentless pursuit of the evil whale, Moby Dick, so to speak, and it's just constantly in motion. So the sort of main characters of those days would not be comfortable people sitting in houses. They would be, battling it out on the frontier against nature, right? Against Native Americans, against modernity sometimes. So this is what the key characteristics of the frontiersman was like. And I would know both of these authors, Cooper and Melville. The book does ask you, and I ask you, what were a couple rare exceptions to this? When would you actually need another human being to survive or to do something?
Have kids.
Okay, yes, of course, to have children. No, I mean, in terms of your life on the frontier. Well, specifically, because many of these men chop down the trees to build their own log cabins. So they talk about barn raising. Where you had to put a roof on a barn, for example. That was not something you could just do solo. So people would come together for barn raising, and you usually would have like a day of it, kind of thing. Another thing that's often mentioned is roads. Like you just really couldn't build a road by yourself. It was kind of the thing that it was one of the few things that individuals on the frontier really asked the government for. They wanted roads, to be built to get to the frontier. And once they chopped down the trees and grew crops, they wanted a way to get the crops to a market somewhere. If you didn't have a road, that was pretty difficult. But a lot of these folks were not selling produce for profit. They were just isolated, living on the frontier as individuals solely. Okay. All right. So yeah, I would definitely know that. Let's move on then. So here again, the very difficult life. A lot of these folks were people who migrated westward primarily because of the exhaustion, particularly the first three states of tobacco land. So if you think about the first three states that were really westward settlements, think about Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. And all three of those states were settled by North Carolinians and Virginians migrating westward primarily because they couldn't grow tobacco here. And so initially that, as they went westward, they would chop down the cane fields, these tall fields that grew there, like these basically big weeds. And what they discovered is that this sort of grass grew very, very well there once you cleared the fields. And so here we have the birth of what's now called Kentucky bluegrass. People around here mix fescue with other types of grass, and it thrives in Kentucky. Kentucky's useful not only for a farm state, it can grow burley tobacco there, but it's tremendously successful for raising horses. You may be aware of I don't know, any of the number of horse races that are run in Kentucky every year. Okay, so definitely be familiar with this. Let's talk now about what the book references as ecological imperialism. So I'm gonna connect you to a film that I'm a big fan of, called The Revenant. but in The Revenant, it's a story of an American fur trapper. And so what happened was the first really successful industry in America, and I mean really before anything else, was fur trapping. So the Dutch did it, the English in New England did it, like the Puritans trapped fur. The success of it was, though, primarily on a handful of sort of rugged wilderness types, just going out into the deepest of the American wilderness, living like Native Americans in a sense, killing all the beaver they could find, bailing them up in these huge bales, and then shipping them back in the river. Okay, and this becomes known as the rendezvous system. It's a French word, rendezvous. And what it meant was, so the first millionaire in America, for example, his name is John Jacob Astor, A-S-T-O-R, and the Astor fortune was built on furs. So you would see these fur trappers go way into the interior. So I'm talking like Louisiana Purchase way into the interior. So it could be as far west as Washington State or Oregon. Certainly the British were there doing that in places around Vancouver today. But all throughout, like the Missouri River and the upwards of these, they would kill beaver. Okay, so beaver were the first, and then they would kill otter. Here you can see the otter. And of course, the third animal they killed later, not as much initially, but these two initially, and then later this would be the buffalo. So they practically wiped these things out. These things were hunted almost to extinction. But they didn't think about it as like, gee, there's a finite amount of this resource, beavers. But between the British, the Dutch, the French, and now the Americans, they were hunting these things up to the verge of extermination. Okay, so I would definitely know those three. Be familiar with the word rendezvous system. That's what these guys are doing here. And I've got a scene or two that I'm going to show you here at the end of our recording from a film with Leonardo DiCaprio, which he won the Oscar for, called The Revenant. And you may have heard of this film where he gets mauled by a bear. So it's a true story of a fur trapper who was left for dead. So anyway, we'll take a look at that film, at least parts of it. So definitely be familiar with ecological imperialism. Okay, know what that means. Now, another thing I have on a YouTube link is this fella. And one of the reasons why we know so much about the frontier, so much about life on the Great Plains, life out west, is George Catlin. So I would be familiar with George Catlin. He himself painted over 600 paintings of Native Americans. He lived with the Native Americans. Like, they didn't kill him. He was from Ohio, either Ohio or Pennsylvania. He's from there, Ohio, Pennsylvania area. But he was restless and had no interest in living like back east. So he moved out west to really the unsettled territory. Because keep in mind, this is like the 1840s. He's in the Dakotas, 1830s and 40s. So it's his, and really these pictures don't do nearly the justice of his. They're in the Smithsonian, about 400 over the Smithsonian Art, the National Art Gallery, and they're mammoth. And what they most frequently display is the beauty of the land. And he was concerned that the Native Americans and the buffalo would be wiped out, and so he is the father of the national park system. So Yellowstone is George Catlin's creation, so to speak, the national park. So I would definitely be familiar with Catlin and the national parks. This guy, and his portraits of the Native American, all the different types, particularly that he encountered, different tribal identity. Here's Yellowstone in the background. That's why that picture is there. So here's the handful of cities in America at the time of the Missouri Compromise. So keep in mind, like with the exception of New Orleans, no major cities out west at all. But you can see almost all of our cities are located where? I mean, it's been that way since colonial days. They're located on the coast, right? So as we see people begin to migrate westward, you start to see the rise of cities along rivers. So if you think about like Cincinnati and Louisville, Ohio River. So rivers are going to be the central non-coastal reason. I mean, Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, all river cities, right? But with the development of things like the Erie Canal in the 1820s, 1830s, then you're going to see enormous explosion of cities around the Great Lakes, okay, along the rivers continuously, and existing cities will grow dramatically. You can see that's a huge number compared to what it was. If you think about New Orleans, it was at 25 to 50, it doubles, okay? And then you actually see the development of what we today call Boss Wash, which is the like non-stop run of cities from Boston all the way down to Washington, D.C., the megalopolis. That's the beginning of that even then, particularly due to the number of immigrants who are migrating to this country. Okay, speaking of immigrants, let's take a look at where they're coming from. By the way, the book, I miswrote on number 12 in your reading guide. Why was America's population increasing so dramatically? And the answer is natural. We were having babies, natural birth rate. But another major characteristic, besides the as one book calls it, the fecundity of Americans, is the rise in immigration. So I have lots of maps here to show you change over time, right? And if you had to make one simple generalization, it's what's happening to the population density. It is moving where? Definitely moving westward, definitely more and more urban along, and you can almost follow it to like directly along the Ohio River, the Mississippi, and the Missouri River, like those three rivers initially. Then, Tennessee's folks are a little bit slower to get there because they're going over Appalachian Mountains, right, over the Cumberland, and then they're settling in around the Cumberland River and the Tennessee River. But initially, that's harder to get to. So they kind of East Tennessee initially, then they make it out to Nashville and places like that. So definitely birth rate. Keep in mind, if people are half the country is under the age of 30, they're having lots of kids. This is pre-factory workers, so children would make labor and help you, work on the farm, and they're actually like useful in terms of that. Now, once you start to see the factories develop in New England, there's two different factors there. Like people are going to start having fewer kids in industrial cities because that just means more mouth to feed. They don't make enough money to offset the difficulty. But definitely over most of this period, you'll see a great number of redoubling of the population. But this is the beginning of when immigration, we call this first wave immigration to America. If you consider who the original immigrants to America, you got to start with non-Native American, that narrative as Americans. Okay, I realize that Native Americans are the first so-called immigrants. They've been there for millennia, perhaps. So, who were the first to come to America? We kind of covered this, but the number one would be who? It was half the population. English. So English people are half the people who migrated to America originally. Scots-Irish, some Germans, and of course African American. Right? Those are the bulk of the original. And again, I say some German, meaning not a lot. More Scots-Irish. Remember that group? Not to be confused with the famine Irish either. The Scots-Irish are really Scottish people who had migrated first to Ireland and then to America. Okay, so the Presbyterians, the guys of Appalachia. Okay, but now you're going to have an enormous new group of people. Okay, and you're probably familiar with this. So what two groups? Well, Irish and who? Germans. Now I will say this. Irish, it's easy to say, the Irish. The Germans, it's a little bit trickier because there is no country called Germany in 1848. If you study world history, in 1848, there are failed revolutions throughout Central Europe, one of which is in Frankfurt. The Frankfurt Assembly attempts to make the King of Prussia the ruler of Germany, and it fails. The Emperor of Prussia rejects it. And so if you're a German, what they call liberal, you're looking to create like representative government in Germany with constitutions and elections. And the leader of Prussia has no interest in being the leader of Germany that way. He will, as Bismarck later says, make those decisions with blood and iron, meaning warfare and not liberalism. So German in 1848 is a language. It's an ethnicity. It's not a nationality. German unification, the Franco-Prussian War has not happened yet. So when we talk about German immigrants, keep in mind that's the Germanies, not a single nation state called Germany. Got it? And that's, like I said, until the Franco-Prussian War, there is no nation state called Germany. All right. So we will call them German, but that's because that's the language they speak in their culture, not because of a nationality. Dig? So why the Irish? The famine Irish. What happened? Well, before I guess I should answer that, let's look at the number 14, the reasons for Europeans, and that's not a typo, by the way. The word immigration with an E is not a mistake. So let's take a look at, from your textbook, if you guys have already done this, you feel free to participate. Why were people migrating to America? Immigration with an E. Don't hesitate to volunteer out loud. All right, so there was a sense of overcrowding in Europe. Now, I tend to argue that that was a perception, not a reality. But in other words, they felt crowded because there weren't as many cities. And so keep in mind, like the city of Manchester, England, barely has any people in it yet, and soon it will become a massive city, right? But yes, there was a sense that if you have a surplus population, what's your problem? What do people do if there's a surplus population? Well, they migrate around. They like wander around looking for work. Think like the Okies of the Dust Bowl. Maybe you've heard of them, but the folks who lost their job in Oklahoma, lost their farms, and migrated around looking for work. So these are like homeless people to a degree looking for jobs, but there's so many of them moving about. It creates this sense of real dislocation. People are really not with us. But yeah, a sense of surplus. What else? All right, from aristocracy, what do you mean by that? It's not wrong. So freedom from a social order that was set in stone. So in other words, I think the book even uses the word caste, i.e. like caste system, right? A social order that you keep in mind in America, there are no dukes, there are no barons, So in Europe, it would be the problem in Europe, guys, particularly, is that there was no more land available. And even though we know it was a shifting period to the Industrial Revolution, land in the minds of almost everyone equaled self-sufficiency. And all the land was in the hands of these manor lords, which meant you would never be able to own any land. You would never be able to rise above your station, meaning you were stuck. Whatever you were born into, and this is how 1,000 years of English history or European history have been. But where could you escape this? In the land. Yeah, in the land of the free, right? Land of opportunity, America. So yes, freedom from the caste system of social order, but also free, and you could put this as letter C, freedom from an organized religion. The fact was, by that I mean no established churches in America anymore. Those days. So if you were in Europe, who determined your religious beliefs? The government did, right? The king did. Like that was your religion, whatever the state religion was. And quite a few of the Germans, like the Amish and the Mennonites, had no desire in being like a prescribed Catholic or a prescribed Lutheran. Okay, so religious freedom. What's an America letter?
It's talking about how people
Okay. So what I would like you to learn for a moment here is what are called push-pull factors. When immigrants leave somewhere, it's either one of two reasons. They're either being pushed out of where they're leaving or they're being pulled to where they're going. America is overwhelming a land of pull. All right, like we are a magnet. We are attraction. I was telling a kid this the other day. We want to eliminate illegal immigration in this country. There's only one way to do it, and that's arrest everybody who pays them. As long as people are paying them, they will always come. You understand? Because it's a magnet. And the America letter was a letter written by a cousin or an uncle or some friend back to Europe where you ate meat three times a week or heck, maybe even 3 times a day. So while we don't think of the American people today then as plentiful, they were far better off than their European cohorts. So in other words, having access to like Well, land was the number one biggest opportunity, but also being able to eat regularly was an opportunity. So the America letter was sort of a seductive draw. Now, some American businesses actually recruited immigrants. Why would they do that? That's a little bit different than the America letter. Why would they send people overseas to attract people? Guys, I've tried to explain to you that this is the period when New England becomes industrialized. The more people, the less you have to pay. It's called the iron law of wages. So if you can attract people to America from the poorest of the poor, will they work for low in America?
Yes.
So that's another way to, and you know, if you go back to ideas like, anybody remember what the headright system was? You got awarded land if you paid for an indentured servant's passage to the United States. Well, in a way, you were rewarded by booking passage for a low-income person. You understand? Because that meant you had cheap labor supply. And the cheaper your labor, the more your profits were. I think that's reasonable, you know. So definitely, and then lastly, the book points out also the transatlantic voyage, like time and cost, was dramatically reduced with the development of steam power. So when you had steam power, it doesn't cost as much. And I always like to point out to students the Titanic. Now that's not this period, that's 100 years later. But the Titanic had people in steerage. It had cheap seats, cheap berths. You know, like people who were poor could sail on the Titanic. Now they didn't have a nice, you know, deck, but and they were the ones that got to be drowned because they were in the poor part. You know, like they actually unloaded the ship by class. You know, like first class got off. But the point is that with the development of steamships, all right, way cheaper to bring Americans over here. Certainly. And so what you see is a lot of diverse people moving to America. But overwhelmingly, the major availability are Irish people. So when asked about this question, year after year, I'll ask this, what were the chief export of Ireland? It was not potatoes, all right? The folks left Ireland because they did not have potatoes, all right? The potato famine is a blight. It rotted them before they could even really be harvested. And so the chief export of Ireland was Irish people. You know, there are more Irish people in America than there are in Ireland. So, you know, the Great Irish Migration, as it's called. All right. So, yeah, millions would die from this. And again, these are the folks that move to the cities. These are the folks that they get off at the port. They have no money, hardly to speak of. And they then are, I guess for their sake, fortunately, welcomed in by a political machine. Now, you need to understand how this works. So for the Irish, here's the thing. Democracy is kind of funny. Like, and there are people in America today who are alarmed about this, who are white nationalists, because they say at some point in the future, blacks and Hispanics will be just as many people here as white people, and then they will pass laws to not benefit white people. And that's possible. Anything's possible. I don't think it's likely, but what I do think is realistic is that the Irish got off the boats in New York and in Boston, and they didn't move, okay? And the, quote, native people, and they're not native, meaning Native American, but the people who lived in Boston and New York before them would not be able to compete because the Irish would work for cheaper. I mean, the Irish even displaced teenage girls working in Lowell, Massachusetts. But after a while, so many Irish people were there, they became an important political group. And so you had a political machine called Tammany Hall. You definitely need to know this. Tammany Hall is an Irish political machine. It's a Democratic Party machine in New York City, right? And you need to stand if you can't sit with your eyes open. Don't bother coming to school if you can't stay awake in class. Are we clear? Are we? This is the second time. It's the last time I speak to you about it. You understand? All right. So the Irish, when they got here, there were so many of them, they would vote. And so what would create would be a job of the police commissioner, or a job of a cop, or a job of a fireman, right? And so the Irish would then be employed in those jobs. Now, initially they were beaten up. Initially they were targeted for discrimination. But after a while, there were so many of them right? That they became an important voting bloc. And so did you have to pay attention to them as the government? And so what the government says, if you can't beat them, let's join them, i.e. the government became, in a lot of these cities, dominated by the Irish. So there's a reason why we have a paddy wagon. What's a paddy wagon? You guys never been in a paddy wagon. Okay. It's when a cop arrests you and takes you to jail, because so many cops are called paddies because they were what? Irish, Patricks, right? You know, so the Irish became dominant in these municipal governments, not initially, but over time. Over time, it evolved to that. So now, initially, they were targeted because they were different. They were Catholic. You understand? That was not acceptable in America at the time. They drank, how dare they? All right, in a part of America, during a period in American history where that, particularly on Sunday, you know, it's called the Continental Sunday. All right, you know, in Europe, drinking on Sunday was no big deal. In America, where we were puritanical, that was very bad. All right, so they were targeted for, but most importantly, and the reason why like people are targeted today for discrimination is because they thought they would lose their job to them. So when Irish people came to apply, definitely need to know NINA. What's that stand for? No Irish need apply. Right? So it was a sign they would post, no Irish need apply. So the first wave of Irish did not do well. So what they created for themselves were, and the word benevolent means to do good, were societies to help each other out. You know, today, if you're Korean and you get off the boat, you'll find help in Little Korea, or Little China, whatever. So you would find people would migrate to they would find the people who were most like them. They would help set them up with a job, get them an apartment, you know, or someplace to rent. And that's what this group is here, the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Hibernia is the old name of Ireland, you know, like a different name for Ireland. So definitely need to know that. Some Irish formed secretive unions. Now the Maguires were particularly infamous because they would, if the mine owner didn't give them what they wanted, they would blow up the mine. So they became associated with like labor terrorism, labor activism like that. But over time, like I said, definitely know Tammany Hall. And we'll talk about its leader, a guy named Boss Tweed, who became a household name in America. And then again, so many people came here. Did the Irish sort of force their way into American citizenship? And again, I'm going to look at this in another story. We have a movie that will be, at least those of us here will be considering. And it's called The Gangs of New York. And it's about the Irish gangs of New York battling it out with the non-Irish gangs of New York over control of the streets, you know, criminal element. Okay? So I think that pretty much explains the Irish. Germans, that's a different group altogether. So the Germans didn't come because of singularly like a blight. No German blight, although there was famine in several of the German states. But we want to call these Germans 48ers. All right, not to be confused with 49ers. Why are they called 48ers? Well, why 1848? All right, so in World II, I teach about the failed revolutions of 1848, which were attempts by many, including the French, to create liberal governments in the wake of the Congress of Vienna. They failed. So a lot of these Germans are going to be liberal political refugees, and you can put a note in here, they will form the foundation of the Republican Party. So the Germans will be abolitionists, for example. They'll be opposed to slavery. And Abraham Lincoln's name is put into nomination by a German immigrant named Carl Schurz, who becomes a key figure. I don't know if I have Schurz's name. I don't have his name up here, but S-C-H-U-R-Z, Schurz. Schurz and others like him will become key political figures in, in liberal government, liberal politics, particularly in Republican politics. All right, so the 48ers, I would know that. You can see here cultural, things that element that they, but like the Irish, they had other aspects that were seen as, well, non-American. For example, they spoke German when they got here. it would not have been unusual. Oh, by the way, they settled much further west. So if you think about Wisconsin, if you think about the area around the Great Lakes. So I always remind students about what did the Germans pioneer really in America is beer. That's one of the things. So if you think about like Anheuser-Busch, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that's a German family name, the Busch family name. You know, so they brought breweries with them from German, like a lot of times it was we call it like what do they call it? Monasteries. Yeah, they're like monks made beer and stuff like that. So they've been brewing beer since the 1300s or early. They would still speak German. So you could actually go out to Milwaukee or someplace like that and walk into a community. They'd be speaking German. Somebody would be playing Beethoven, on either a piano or a violin. They would have children at elementary schools and stuff like that. So it's almost alien. It's like Germany was transplanted. And you can see why they would move westward to Wisconsin is that they weren't welcome in the East, but they could move intact. They had enough money to get off the boat, get a wagon, fill it up, and then migrate all the way to Wisconsin. So that's where your Germans are going to settle mostly in the Midwest, particularly Wisconsin. Think Milwaukee Brewers, for example, the baseball team. All right. So again, big two, Irish, German, still some English. So how are they responded? They would get off the boat and they would migrate out west. Germans there, you can see the purple. And I put this in here just to remind you of an early concept that became, I think, common in America. And that is this notion of the American dream. So American dream began as the idea of the word material here means to do better. So to do better as a fruit of our country. Okay? So, a lot of countries in Europe really had no opportunity for you. There was no way to move upward in society or even just to improve yourself. And so I always tell my boys, my children, that my American dream is that I can provide an opportunity that they will be better off than in my life, or as happy as my life. It's like my dad and mom want to make sure that my life was as successful as their life. It wasn't necessarily being rich. I think we have this misconception that the American dream means you're going to be super rich or whatever. No, it's not necessarily that. It means that you're able to, through the fruit of your own labor, without anyone obstructing you, right? No discrimination, and again, that's why so much American dream was postponed, unfortunately. And that if you work hard, self-reliance, right, then you'll live comfortably in America. You'll live as a citizen who's free to pursue their own outcomes, which is great because the last thing we want to do is raise a nation of sheep, right? So the other thing that's interesting about the American dream is the idea of invention. For most of history, modern history, we have been the world's most inventive nation. I believe it has to do with stuff like this, because we're free to pursue our own ends and achieve. You understand? That's an opportunity. If you didn't have the freedom to go to college, if you didn't have the freedom to start your own business, then I would start to be concerned about America. That's one of the reasons why I'm very much opposed to the cost of college tuition, because I think it creates such a burden, it reduces your opportunity, at the beginning. But nonetheless, even so, you don't have to go to college to be successful. I got a whole list of careers over there. 2-year associate's programs or training programs you can do. So the opportunity is still there, and that's a hallmark of the American dream. What I am concerned about a little bit is that are we producing enough inventors? I think we're doing pretty well still, and that's good. As long as we have the Elon Musks of the world, as long as we have the folks inventing the next technology, I feel pretty confident that America will continue to have this opportunity. Now, what was the backlash to it? So here's a term we haven't really talked about much, and it's called nativism. If you're not sure what nativism is, you might put in parentheses anti-foreignism. So, when I talk about President Trump being nativist, I don't mean that all foreigners, but certainly his rhetoric has been more heated against illegal immigration and to some degree legal immigration. So nativists believe that there is a Native American, keep in mind, I put that in quotes because they would not have called Native American Indians Native Americans then. They believed they were the Native Americans, okay? And so they were very, very much opposed to this horde. By the way, one term I want you to know here is a phrase, really, and it's anti-papism. So we're not used to, in America, the idea, I mean, at least not in the modern sense, of the Pope being like a bad guy, or the Catholic Church being a bad thing. But Catholics face as much discrimination in America as Jewish people do, if not more so. And so a lot of these immigrants, particularly the Irish and the Germans, were Catholic. And the fear was that their loyalty would be more with the Pope in Rome than it would be to the President of the United States or to the Constitution of the United States. So in other words, they have second loyalties, and that bothered them a lot. And so the Catholic people had to, for lack of a better word, go their own way. And so they would build their own schools. So we call those schools parochial schools, okay? Parochial school. And they still exist, of course. And in fact, today, the Catholic Church is the largest single denomination, Christian denomination in America. But, we don't think about in terms of usually today, people disliking or hating Catholics. So that was a major thing. And they would write pamphlets about why the Catholics were bad, talking about nuns messing around in their convents. Anyway, so they formed a group. Now, first was the Order of the Star Spangled Banner. So they start out with their own little affiliation, and that develops into something called the American Party, or as it's more frequently known, the Know Nothing Party. So you'll see it written American Party or Know Nothing Party. Know Nothing because they had like a secret password. And what they were trying to do even then was ban immigration or cease or limit immigration from anywhere else. They would sometimes use violence. They would attack Catholics, particularly here you see a convent. And this would lead to war, not war, literal, but to violent conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. And this is the stuff I was talking about in the movie Gangs of New York. You have these, nativists going to war with the Irish, literally, and they actually happened. They fought over ethnic differences. Okay, so that was very, very common to have this kind of, but mostly in the urban environments. So definitely be aware of the Know Nothing Party. And let me ask you guys a question that the book asks, which is a kind of, APUSH kind of question, I think. Why was violence less frequent than you might imagine?
Because they had a robust economy, so people actually had jobs.
Okay. And what was very much essential for the functioning of our robust economy? Right, so I understand what you're saying about people having jobs, but the key here is the factories needed the immigrants for cheap labor. You understand? I mean, the growth of the Industrial Revolution was fueled by, among other things, cheap labor supply. They started out with who in America as cheap labor? Women and children. And they would continue to use women and children as cheap labor for much of the history of the Industrial Revolution. But in many places, it would be cheaper labor from immigrants that would even be, even depress wages further. So when you think about like the history of our country, the reason why these factories were so successful is they didn't have to pay their workers anything. Now, I repeatedly say this, America, you don't want America manufacturing stuff today. Why? Everything's going to cost a lot, As Americans, well, we want health care. We want decent pay. We don't want to just work for nothing and get nothing. So the problem is that back then the Irish would do that. And again, that led to people migrating elsewhere, You know, where the Irish settled often, and it happens throughout history. Does anybody know who lives in Harlem mostly today? Used to be black folks, not anymore. Not like it used to be. All right, Puerto Ricans. Okay. Jews used to live out in Queens, right? In Brooklyn. Not anymore. So in other words, every generation, an immigrant group sort of displaces the previous generational group. And those folks move somewhere else a lot of times. And so what you'll see here is the Irish will become the factory workers, the miners, like overwhelmingly. But yeah, of course, the robustness of the economy. But what that means is you had to have the labor supply in order to keep those factories operating, right? What else made them nice is that not only were they labor supply, they were also the market. They could afford to buy the shirts that they manufactured in the clothing. You understand? It wasn't much money, but it was better than Europe. That's the thing that you got to keep in mind is that these people definitely were doing better off than their European counterparts were. Okay? There would have been no American Industrial Revolution, in other words, had there not been for immigration, because there just weren't enough food. Maybe I should have started with that question. Why weren't we having industry earlier? I usually start with that in an essay. Why weren't we having industry earlier than this? All right, like who wants to give up your nice yeoman farm to go work in a factory? What else? The lack of labor supply. We weren't aware of the natural resources we had. Hadn't tapped into them. Okay, no capital hardly to speak of because what things had been very limited. Banks, remember the bus, right? So without an ample supply of capital, people aren't going to go into that. So yeah, we're going to, in the next section that you're going to be reading, which is creeping mechanization and Whitney ends the fiber famine. Keep in mind, why was the Industrial Revolution slow to begin? You know, why were we slow to get to this point? Okay. All right. Well, that's enough for today on that. I've given you enough, I think, to work on for the next 2 days. We're watching a movie here that some of you guys watched in class yesterday on Irish immigration. Okay. Any questions before we log out?